After angering some of my anti-scientific subscribers, I'm back to doing more Dark Souls 2 content. Carlo asked me if I can respond to Akasha Rose over-analysis of Dark Souls 2 bosses. That video already started with a disclaimer that made me want to make this response.
Dark Souls 2. Before I begin analyzing the bosses, I feel obliged to mention that I do not like Dark Souls 2.
I also have to clarify that despite Carlo claiming otherwise, it's all just Akasha Rose's personal opinion and he did not present his course as objective facts.
As always, this entire video is just full of my opinion.
Responding to opinions feels weird, so I will try to focus more on what I consider to be signs of bias.
The grade that I will be giving bosses will not vary game to game within this series. A C grade boss in Dark Souls 2 is at the same level to me as a C grade boss in Dark Souls 1.
Now that's something I can work with, as I can draw parallels between bosses that he gave the same grade to see if Akasha is just harsher on DS2.
I'm not a Dark Souls 2 fan, but a lot of comments were saying I hate it because it's not Dark Souls 1. I hate Dark Souls 2 the most when it's trying to be Dark Souls. There is really good stuff in Dark Souls 2. The worst part about Dark Souls 2 is the Dark Souls. And that feels like a weird contradiction because I love this series so much, but I love experimental Souls-like games.
Okay, now that we have some context, let us jump to the first boss.
Overall, I would give the Last Giant a D grade. It's not an insulting fight, but the underwhelming moveset and hollow second phase leave the encounter feeling forgettable, and frankly, not a great starting place for Dark Souls 2.
I will soon dive deeper into his justification for the D grade, but first, let me show you some obviously worse bosses that got the same grade.
And he gets a D grade. But I can barely justify giving him a D grade. The Butterfly earns a D grade.
Yeah, you shouldn't act surprised that people think that
I hate it because it's not Dark Souls 1.
When you place an okay boss like the Last Giant on one level with some of the worst bosses, I think we can all agree that the Moonlight Butterfly is
mind-numbingly boring.
He spent several minutes complaining just how bad this fight is.
Once the Butterfly is finished the loop once, the fight just starts to drag on. The atmosphere stays stagnant, and it makes the fight kind of a slog. But it is such a tedious fight.
And apparently the Last Giant is just as bad. So let us hear why Akasha feels that way.
The Giant also participates in an overall game design trope that I am not a personal fan of. Bosses who hold keys to random doors. Why is that door locked? And B, why does the Last Giant have the only key? It makes the Last Giant feel less like a natural obstacle the player encounters and more like an enemy on a checklist to complete the game.
He did not complain that the Asylum Demon, Capo Demon or Gaping Dragon dropped keys, so it seems like this is somehow only an issue if it happens in Dark Souls 2.
This thing, more than any other boss up to this point, feels like a boss fight. Its damage one-shots most builds. On the other hand, the hitboxes on the charge are not great, which, when it does as much damage as it does, can be pretty frustrating. Overall, I think the Gaping Dragon does earn a low B grade. It stumbles a lot, and there are a lot of things I can say are wrong, but I just really enjoy the fight.
Gaping Dragon earned a B grade, which is the same as what he gave to Sir Alon.
Even with that harsh criticism, Alon does get a B grade. He's still an entertaining battle with an astounding presentation, though I think he's also emblematic of something that I have with Dark Souls 2 in general. Dark Souls 2, the bosses are very simple, and I think it's to a fault. It's hard to analyze a lot of the bosses because they only have a couple of moves, and they are only interested in not telling a story through the boss design, but creating one moment and extending that moment out.
Bosses in DS2 are bad for having simple movesets, but bosses in DS1 having even simpler movesets is somehow okay.
In terms of moveset, though, there's not much going on. I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, though. Unfortunately, the Last Giant's moveset is simple to a fault. It swipes down and it stomps. You'll be slapping his ankles the whole fight, which is where the struggles of adaptability end up rearing their head for the first time in most people's runs.
So it's okay that the Gaping Dragon has a simple moveset, but it's inexcusable that the first boss in DS2 is easy so that beginners can learn how to play the game.
The Asylum Demon's moveset can be broken down into two main attack types. The first is some general swinging of its hammer. I'd say that the Asylum Demon does deserve an A grade.
The Asylum Demon earned an A grade, even though many of the same things that made it great as a tutorial boss were seen as flaws in DS2.
This entire moveset is built really well to drill in the fundamentals of rolling and positioning right from the start.
And it seems like his core for the Last Giant just ignores the fact that he also teaches players the importance of positioning and, more importantly, of not being greedy.
The hitboxes on his stomps definitely feel stacked in the Giant's favor, and it's never clear quite how far away you really need to be to avoid damage. He never stops attacks once they start, so the iffy hitboxes often means that playing optimally means you step back and watch him stomp aimlessly for a few moments before you return to biting his ankle.
Getting hit by clearly visible shockwaves is something that people naturally accept if it happens in any FromSoft game, but somehow falsely accuse it of being broken hitboxes if it happens in DS2.
Every attack creates this cloud of rubble and dust,
Which is exactly what every stomp of the Last Giant also does. But as with almost every other DS2 review, somehow it's a bad hitbox if that rubble damages you in DS2, while at the same time being a good feature if it happens in other Souls games. A great example of Akasha Rose being biased in favor of DS1's hitboxes is the Iron Golem and his infamously broken grab hitbox.
The final environmental twist is the tight bridge. Similar to Taurus Demon, the Iron Golem takes up the entire bridge, but unlike the Taurus Demon, the Iron Golem has hitboxes that make sense.
Just like the Last Giant, the shockwaves on his stomps can damage you, but as it's not in DS2, it makes sense to him. And even though we saw him experiencing Iron Golem's magnetic grab attack, it's not even worth mentioning that grabs in DS1 generally have much worse hitboxes than those in DS2.
Most of my issues with Alon come from his moveset and hitboxes. His hitboxes, particularly on his grab, feel less than stellar.
Every single video that tries to show how broken Alon's grab is shows the player getting hit, unlike many other bosses in DS1 and DS3 that actually have broken grab hitboxes. Gaping Dragon, Curse Rotted Greatwood and Iron Golem have grab hitboxes that extend several feet around their arm, unlike Alon where you need to actually get stabbed by his sword.
Their jump attack has a messy hitbox which stops players from rolling into punish,
Looks perfectly fine to me.
but you will have a short time to fight the second before the third arrives. Once it does, the fight goes from a bit underwhelming to completely falling apart. Since they share the exact same AI, their movesets will overlap constantly. They cover distance fast enough with their spinning attack that finding a safe moment to attack one is entirely based on luck.
I have to disagree with him both on how unpunishable the jump attack is and also how hard it is to find an opening to attack.
It doesn't, however, fix the myriad issues caused by their overlapping AIs. If you thought the Bell Gargoyles occasionally overlapped or Ornstein and Smo left few windows, the Rune Sentinels are coded to leave even less. I would give the Rune Sentinels the first F grade in this video.
Half the time they are just passively strolling around, so most of the time you're only engaging with one of them. There are so few moments where both of them attack, and if they do, you can usually punish both of them, as most of their attacks leave a long punishment window, including the jump attack. Now, let me contrast this F grade with a ganky boss from Dark Souls 1.
Once the first gargoyle is at half health, the second spawns in. If the player gets a stagger and a tail cut, it is possible to burst down the first gargoyle, but a new player still figuring out their weapons will usually struggle to execute that correctly. The second makes the fight much more demanding, and if both the gargoyles attack in melee, their wide, fast attacks make it almost impossible to break in and punish them. You really need to play their tempo.
Even when I'm using a weapon that's as weak as his +3 bandit axe, I can still sometimes manage to defeat the second one before I have to deal with the third one. But I would argue that both the gargoyles and the sentinels are an early game wall with a blacksmith around the corner because they want you to first explore more and upgrade your weapon a bit.
The Bell Gargoyles do a pretty effective job at ensuring the player has a good weapon, introduces fighting 2 bosses at a time, and continues the Taurus Demon's trend of encouraging coming up with a strategy in advance. Rush down the first, cut its tail, go for the stagger, or go for the fire breather.
He could have easily have had a +6 weapon at this point, which combined with Goldbine resin would have made it much easier to only fight against one at a time. But it seems like having to strategize is only a plus if it happens in DS1.
Despite the few faults of overlapping attacks and that frustrating flyby attack that I probably hate way more than I should, I think the Bell Gargoyles do earn a B grade.
For the gargoyles, he mentioned similar issues as for the Rune Sentinels, but they got a B grade while the Sentinels were placed on the very bottom of the scale. Okay, now let me contrast it with yet another Genki DS1 boss.
Once a second king spawns, though, it becomes impossible to avoid damage reliably. Their moveset requires the constant attention of the player, and half of their bodies being below the player's ground level means once you're surrounded, the camera struggles significantly. Attacks coming from behind can feel unfair, and the kings are almost immobile, which means separating them is not realistic. This fight is a damage test. If you cannot kill a king before the next one spawns, you will be swarmed and you will be killed. The gimmick does help to justify the unfair design, but it can still become frustrating if you don't have enough damage for the fight.
Now take a guess what score the 4 kings got.
Overall, I think the 4 kings earn a solid B grade. They're an above average fight, particularly off their atmosphere and style.
I actually only wanted to bring them up as they require many people to look up how to even access this boss fight, which I would like to use to transition to another boss where many people look up the solution.
Whatever it is, the boss fight as it stands is held back by its environmental interaction. I give Mytha a D grade, which is a shame because I usually love this kind of arena creativity.
Moving on to another D grade. But first, yes, he actually mentioned several times that he does like the experimental aspects of this game.
The bosses where Dark Souls 2 shines the most for me, of Nishandra, of the Burnt Ivory King, are playing with concepts that you do not find elsewhere in Dark Souls. More heavy focus on mob control, more heavy focus on thematic mechanics that are notably unfair, that it's not something you can dodge. It is something that, oh, you're around this, you'll take damage, you'll take curse, you'll be afflicted by this. There are these really interesting mechanics in this game here that feel like they're limited by the fact Dark Souls 2 is a Dark Souls game, that you have your role, that you have these attacks.
When I heard this, I expected him to appreciate Mytha more.
This means that without burning this specific windmill, you must do the entire fight with fat rolls, a slowed movement speed, well poisoned in a game where poison is buffed significantly, while the boss is healing constantly. Mytha would be an average, maybe even an above average boss fight, but this environmental effect is so massive and so unintuitively hidden that it completely ruins everything the boss was trying to accomplish. Mytha gives no signal that the poison is something you can even change, but the difference in difficulty without doing it is so massive. Maybe if the poison didn't make you fat roll.
In the previous clip, you saw me do this fight with his build, but I did not feel like getting slowed down and also did not have to fat roll. It seems like he was exaggerating just how little it actually impacts the fight if you simply regularly consume a life gem.
The second phase is where, in my mind, Dark Souls 2 introduces the best boss gimmick in the entire game. Smelter Demon starts to deal chip damage to anyone next to it as the fire in its torso intensifies. Now, I usually hate force damage in a boss fight, and everywhere else it appears in the series, I will call it out as bad, but Dark Souls 2 has life gems. If you keep consistently popping life gems, the damage over time does nothing to you. This is the only time in Dark Souls 2 that the game displays an awareness of the player's unique attributes and abilities. That's something I feel is missing from so many bosses in Dark Souls 2. The best bosses in any game use their abilities to interact with the player's abilities, pushing them to an absolute limit and forcing them to change the basic way they engage with the game.
I think the fact that life gems work to negate the constant damage applies to the poison of Mytha as well.
Psst. Have you heard? Well, apparently, there's this monster lady, right? And the poison, well, does wonders for her body. You know, the health and beauty and that sort of stuff.
The fight is perfectly doable without getting rid of the poison, but seeing a passive enemy guarding something should make you curious enough to try to see what secret he could be protecting.
That damned hag just can't let her old flame go. She's going to get us all burned.
You can dodge an attack, heal the moment your roll is done, and he'll have already hit you before you finished healing. But Gwyn is the only boss in the entire game who can be parried.
It seems to be acceptable that you practically need outside help to figure out some things in DS1, for example that you can parry Gwyn, but the moment a bit outside the box thinking is required in DS2, it tanks the score of a boss.
With that said, though I appreciate the fight regardless of the tempo, his aggression can often feel like a little too much. Without parrying, Gwyn is frustratingly difficult to the point I've seen a lot of new players struggle until they hear about his massive weakness.
Dark Souls 2 has a few more bosses that become slightly less frustrating if you know about their hidden mechanic.
But other than that, she runs around the arena a lot, has enough health that some weapons will break at the end of the fight, which, as I mentioned with Sin, is not what I'd call great design. Though Sin's health bar feels the correct length for the fight, it does not play well with the weapon durability system. I have never gotten through a fight with Sin without my weapon running out of durability. Yes, you can use repair powder, but I don't understand why my weapons break on Sin, but not on the Ancient Dragon.
Both Aava and Sinh deal more durability damage if you hit their body.
I am of the opinion that weapons breaking as quickly as they do in Dark Souls 2 puts a huge damper on these longer endurance fights, and Sin is one of the fights that it suffers from the most.
Both the head and tail are safe spots to attack Sinh, but hitting his legs can quickly destroy your weapon. Like every other FromSoft dragon, it is beneficial to fight him by hitting his head.
This boss could have been literally anything and it would work, and we just got a dull dragon. It's an F-grade fight. I don't even know what to say about it. It's a boring fight against a disappointing enemy.
Aldia was trying to recreate dragons, so he did experiments on giants, drakes and all kinds of large enemies. And in the end, he managed to create the fake ancient dragon that we will find in the next area.
The honor of the worst dragon in the game goes to the Ancient Dragon, who has two moves. He stomps or he does a fire breath that one-shots most builds. For a boss with two moves, you think that wouldn't last long, but this is one of the longest boss fights in the entire series, even with a good weapon.
It does not turn him into more than a C-grade boss, but going for his head makes his moveset more interesting and also makes it easier to dodge his fire breath.
On top of that, the fire breath, the second of the two moves that it has, is one of the worst moves in the entire game. There is only one direction to run when it breathes to reliably dodge it, towards the Ancient Dragon's tail. If that tail is off the edge of the map, you're shit out of luck. Getting the Ancient Dragon to move away from those edges verges on impossible, as he just stands there, completely disinterested in anything but doing more fire breath attacks. I mentioned before that I'm trying not to rate bosses off the quality of the area, but after you beat the Ancient Dragon, every enemy from outside, of which there are a frankly unholy number, re-aggro to you, charge into the arena and attack. I had stopped the recording, but I didn't select the feather fast enough and just died. It's not hard to just code enemies not to aggro into an arena, but Dark Souls 2 just creates this insult for a dragon fight and then wants you to suffer even more inside the arena.
This is something that only happens to players that rush through the game without fighting any enemies on the way. See? They are just chilling and don't have any intention of attacking me. Right from the beginning of this area, the game tries to teach you that you are supposed to engage in honorful duels. All the knights bow down to you, and at the top of the stairs is their leader. He is glowing brightly to draw extra attention to the fact that you are supposed to fight him. If you still decide to just run past him, you will quickly notice that all of them became hostile. You just have to defeat him once in order to permanently earn the right to just run past them. Here is something else that should be pretty obvious. Have you ever noticed these weird statues in front of the DLC doors? The same statues also show up in front of the most hated areas, and that's because those statues are summoning pools for co-op. You can place your summon sign at the statues outside of the DLC door to access these areas even if you do not even own the DLC.
Oh no, it's an F grade fight. Oh, this is bad. This is all bad. Why did they make this fight? These are just NPCs. They aren't even new NPCs. This one's just Havel. He was in Dark Souls 1.
I'm still convinced that the Gang Squad, Iron Passage and Frigid Outskirts are only hated as much as they are because people just ignore the fact that they always have to step over 2 to 3 summoning signs and instead force themselves to do these completely optional co-op challenges solo.
None of this needed to be here. You could have just had 2 bosses in this DLC. I mean, people would have been sad just to look at Ashes of Ariandel, but they wouldn't have had to fight these guys. I mean, hell, you can still cut them. Someone can go in and patch the game and seal up the door to the Cave of the Dead, and then no one will have to fight them ever again. FromSoft employee, listen to me right now. The power is yours. You can do it. You can do it. You can delete the afflicted grave robbers. Do it now!
Or you could just play as intended and summon a couple of friends.
And then to follow it up, the boss that you are rewarded with is not only a reskin of Aava, the boss fight fought immediately before it, but a boss fight against 2 Aavas at the same time, with the boss gaining a move to heal itself and decrease the damage taken. I do not say this lightly, but this fight was a mistake. It tries to use the same principle as the Bell Gargoyles, where a boss arrives halfway through the fight, but unless you are spec'd for maximizing damage and the boss does not decide to hop away without warning, you end up fighting 2 at once with no change to their AI.
Or, if you play as intended and make use of the increased summoning limit, you fight 4 versus 2 and will have a much better experience.
The fact FromSoft sold the DLC with a hidden boss who's just a repeat of a boss already accessible in the main game with just a couple delayed animation is remarkably lazy and bloats an already bloated boss roster further than it needs to be. So my question came down to this. Do I rate the Blue Smelter Demon badly for the fact that it is a cheap reselling of a good boss at a premium rate?
That's a very common mistake people make in rating these co-op challenges. He falsely assumes that he paid extra for a reskin boss, even though these areas function as advertisement for the DLCs and can be accessed from the main game. You do not need to buy the DLC to fight the Gang Squad, Lattenzeln or Blue Smelter Demon. These areas are physically located in the DLC, but technically they are not part of the DLC as they are not extra content you need to buy and download. Just place your summon sign at one of the statues in front of the DLC door and you can get summoned into these areas and even get rewarded with special item drops during co-op.
Smelter Demon is a great fight and I think it earns a high A grade. For some players, a great fight is enough, but I personally like a bit more oomph in the bosses that I call cream of the crop. With that said, the Smelter Demon is the first high point that I always look forward to in the run of Dark Souls 2.
We can tell that he is not against using summons, as he was using one during one of his favorite fights. So I don't understand why he did not consider the same option for areas that are obviously designed for multiplayer. I just hope that Night Rain will open up the eyes of the FromSoft community to make them see just how fun these co-op challenges can be if you summon 3 friends instead of insisting on doing a raid dungeon solo. Hope you enjoyed this video. Goodbye!